This is ICAStnews.com, live and direct from United Nations headquarters in New York City, USA. And this is the Russia folder. Words, words, words. Russian words, American words about Russia, and unpleasant, unprintable words are circulating in this year's American presidential election. Some of them are wise, some of them are worrisome. Some of them are simply wrong. We're told that Vladimir Putin described Donald Trump as a brilliant man. Mistranslation. He said yarky. Yarky is more like fluorescent, bright color as opposed to the regular colors you might find in a Crayola box, like a fluorescent marker. But he does ask some good questions. Maybe they're naive questions, like the little boy who declares that the emperor is naked. He asks, why can't Russia and the United States get along in international diplomacy and economic relations and in general? It's a good question, one the Russia folder and ICAST News has been grappling with for a number of years. But before there was the misinterpretation of what Putin said, before Donald Trump indicated that he wasn't sure whether he would enforce the part of the NATO doctrine that called for the protection of all allies, meaning come to the rescue of the little Baltic states, it was not so much a question of did the Kremlin, did the leadership inside the Russian Beltway love Trump, but why do they hate Hillary Clinton? It's a good and important question. Most generally, Russians seem to prefer Republican leaders over Democrats. The one exception is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who called the Soviet dictator Stalin Uncle Joe, and who worked with him in the Second World War. Otherwise, think about it. Harry Truman dropped the atomic bomb. Some think it was a threat directed against Moscow. He helped start the Cold War. John Kennedy stood up to Khrushchev in the Cuban Missile Crisis, what the Russians call the Caribbean Crisis, and made them eat humble pie on the world stage. Jimmy Carter ordered the boycott of the 1980 Olympics in Moscow and launched what gave birth to Al-Qaeda and terrorist movement when he and his advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski ordered American CIA operatives to supply rebels to kill Russian boys after they invaded Afghanistan. And Bill Clinton and company tore up the post-Cold War agreement that the Russians believed in so much, the NATO agreement. The Clinton clique is said to be at the heart of the original sin of the post-Cold War world. At least that's what is seen inside the Russian Beltway, the policymakers who look out and help Russia form its policy. The Clinton clique is a troika. 3 people: Bill, Hillary, Bill's best buddy from his graduate school days, right-hand man for Russian affairs, Strobe Talbot, and sometimes added to this is Strobe Talbot's longtime chief of staff, Victoria Nuland. In November 1993, at Camp David, in a stroll in the woods, the Clinton clique, Strobe, Bill, and Hillary, decided to tear up what was regarded as one of the great accomplishments of the Bush administration and the great accomplishments in the winding down of the Cold War. President Bush and his extremely able Secretary of State, James Baker, in order to ensure the reunification of East and West Germany, vowed to Gorbachev, the man then in charge of Russia, that they would not extend NATO 1 inch beyond the boundaries of the then German East German state. It was said, and scholars still argue about how much this was a generalized statement, but in the perception of the Russians, in dismantling the Cold War order, the Republican administration, speaking for all of America, promised NATO would not come up and threaten the borders, threaten the homeland security of Russia. If you look at the map, you can see how far NATO expanded right up to borders right around Russia under the Clinton administration. This was seen as simply one of the worst mistakes possible. In addition, Hillary Clinton was seen to have abetted the worst elements in the mind of the Kremlin establishment. With the man who headed Mr. Obama's Russia policy, Michael McFaul, with whom she had some disagreements, but still, McFaul, who was an advocate of NGOs, non-government organizations spreading democracy in Russia, and who became the American ambassador and became the symbol of the West trying to undermine the Putin regime. With him, Hillary Clinton went to Moscow, and during the time of great demonstrations that threatened, in at least the minds of some, the stability of the Putin regime, called on people to assert their rights to demonstrate, their rights to have legitimate elections. The implication was that the elections for Putin's parliament were rigged, and they probably were. But she was seen as egging on what Putin saw as the worst elements of destabilization, and what was particularly haunting to the Kremlin was the idea that the Americans had been involved in the so-called colored revolutions, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, revolutions in other states near the borders of the former Soviet Union, within the former Soviet Union, but near the borders of Russia, had promoted regimes hostile to the Putin way of doing things. And of course, in just the broadest terms, for the Putin regime, which blames much of the destruction of values on its predecessor, on what was going on under Yeltsin, the Clintons were seen as too close to the man who destroyed so many basic Soviet values. Bill Clinton liked to laugh, put his hand on his shoulder, pal around, and drink with Boris Yeltsin. He frankly said once, "I love this guy." He had been warned by the American ambassador to many of the new states there, Steve Sestanovich, not to get too close to Yeltsin, that he was seen as having a personal relationship. This personal relationship washes over, as most Russians now blame Yeltsin particularly for the radical economic reforms that crushed normal, civilized, everyday life, where people couldn't afford to bury their grandmothers because of inflation and other things. In addition, the clique of Hillary Clinton is seen and known through analysis and perhaps by invasion of government secrets. It's known that the person that Putin is trying to defend most strongly now, Syrian leader, dictator, strongman, murderer, Bashar al-Assad, that the person arguing for a stronger policy to push him out of office was none other than Hillary Clinton. She did not get her way with this, but still she was seen as being an antagonist to what Russia and Putin wanted in the world. And then, of course, there is the additional element of Ukraine. Ukraine, which had its own revolution, throwing out the man the Kremlin favored, Yanukovych, Kiev, which had demonstrations destabilizing the society, changing the government, regime change, which were seen largely to be the handiwork, not only of Ukrainian dissidents and those who wanted freedom, but American Ukrainians who were interfering in their ancient homeland. There's more than a whiff of suspicion that people like George Soros and parts of the U.S. government were encouraging these movements. Ukraine's very close and very dear to the Russians. Strobe Talbot's longtime chief of staff became a big mucky-muck in the State Department. She went there. She even handed out cookies to the demonstrators trying to overthrow the regime that the Russians favored. And then we have tapes of her phone conversations in which she says some of those words we don't like to use on television and in online media. And other things, she is demanding that her man become the prime minister of the new Ukraine. She's telling about how she fooled Ban Ki-moon on the issue of regime change in Kiev. And she's seen as the point person, and by extension, the Clinton clique is seen as the handmaidens, the encouragers, the enablers, the pickers of the people who went against the order that Moscow liked right on their borders. And not finally, because the final list is so long, there's the old question of perfidy at the United Nations. Betrayal of trust, lies, falsehood, tampering with the truth. American ambassadors have come here and tampered with the truth before. Adlai Stevenson during the Cold War. More recently, the famous case of Colin Powell, who besmirched his own reputation by swearing up and down before the United Nations that the world had to go to war with Iraq because it had weapons of mass destruction. Well, Hillary Clinton was seen as engaging in this same UN perfidy. It's the question of Muammar Gaddafi, the question of invading Libya, where she convinced her sometime friend, and do you betray friends, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and the Russian mission, that it was out of humanitarian instincts that the West was going to go into Libya, not for regime change, that they really weren't going to do anything drastic. And so after a good deal of persuasion and belief that she was being genuine, the U.S. military assisted in an operation which unleashed forces that overthrew, changed the regime, murdered Muammar Gaddafi. His body, seen dead, was dragged around. For the West, if you look at this headline from a British newspaper, it was seen as retribution. In Russia, which saw over and over again the pictures of Gaddafi, it was seen as betrayal of a promise and more destabilization of the world through the American idea of regime change. The Russians thought they were made to look like rubes when, in the crucial vote in the Security Council, they did not veto the American initiative to go into Libya. They notably abstained. Russia has a veto. It can stop things. But it believed the Americans and abstained. And when told they were not after regime change, Hillary Clinton was noted to have remarked about the invasion and actions in Libya. We came, we saw, he died. Trust and truth went out the window. This was seen as Western hypocrisy. And for even the most Western-oriented America liking agents inside Moscow, this is nothing new about the Clinton clique. People who were hostile in the 90s to what Boris Yeltsin and the military-industrial complex in Russia was doing in Chechnya, in bombing Grozny back into the Stone Age, found it highly hypocritical when Strobe Talbot, the point man on Russia, would fly into Sheremetyevo Airport and tell all the reporters waiting and tell other folks that he was just glad to be there. Moscow was beautiful in the snow, refusing to criticize the bloodbath that Yeltsin was visiting on the Chechens because they didn't want to do anything to hurt their personal man, their good friend, Boris Yeltsin. In other words, America was silent when a kind of mini genocide was going on. This was seen even by those who wanted to see the war stopped as an example of American lack of courage, liberal wishy-washiness, perfidy, and hypocrisy. And they saw again this same kind of action with Hillary Clinton. And now, with Hillary Clinton in a good spot to run for president of the United States, to perhaps win, with lots of talk that lots of her emails and other things are being made public by the Russians, which hasn't really totally been denied. They're not really trying to overthrow the election. They may be just getting a little even for someone they hate. The problem is many. The problems are many here. But one of the most lasting ones is the damage done here is going to make it even harder to answer that good question that Mr. Trump in his naivete posed. Why can't there be better relations between the United States and Russia? Part of the problem is there is strong enmity between the ruler in Moscow and the person it sure looks like is going to be the new ruler in Washington, and the idea of another Clinton clique is spooky to the spooks who run the Russian government. For ICAStNews.com, live and direct from New York City and the United Nations, for the Russia Folder,